I want to welcome you to the Inner City Church of Christ this morning, and if you're watching this online, either on our Facebook page or our YouTube channel, then that means today is most likely a snow day and not having services today, and so we've kind of recorded this just a little bit ahead of time in order to prepare for that, with the anticipation that this was going to be a snow week for us, and I know there's probably a lot of other churches that are closed their services today and providing that online, and that's kind of what we're doing this morning. I would remind you that there's several announcements that we would normally make about our schedule. Our schedule this week, as far as Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, that'll kind of be based on the school schedule, and so if Metro Schools are open on that day, then we are open on that day. You probably already know most of the people that we would have on our prayer list, that we would encourage you to continue to remember them in prayers. We've been announcing for the last couple of weeks about a scholarship opportunity that is available for students at the Inner City Church of Christ or at Nashville Inner City Ministry to help with paying for some college tuition or some other educational opportunities if they're doing something along the lines of going to school to be a carpenter or an electrician or a plumber or a nurse or something along those lines. That application is now available. It's on our ministry website, or you can contact our church office in order to get that. So we'd encourage you to be thinking about that. And then also, I believe on our slides this morning, as one of the slides that's available for our giving platforms, and since we're not meeting in person this morning, if you would like to give either directly online to the Nashville Inner City Church of Christ website or by Cash App, that would certainly be available as well. And so this morning we're going to be looking at primarily one text in 1 Kings chapter 18, and we'll begin about halfway through this story. And I'll pull up some of that text here in just a few moments. But in the text, in the story that we're going to be looking at this morning, the children of Israel, they've already all fallen away from the Lord. And an evil family that is comprised of King Ahab, who was the 8th king over Israel and was noted for mostly for his petulance, for his immorality, but then also his wife Jezebel that you've probably read about. They had taken over the land, and as you'll see, they've literally been killing all of God's prophets, those who were supposed to be working to get the children of Israel to return to the Lord. Here Jezebel is, and King Ahab is killing the prophets of God. So when you get to the chapter 18, God has already caused a severe famine in the land, hoping that this would get the attention of his wayward children and of King Ahab, and perhaps that would cause them to begin to listen to some of the prophets that God had sent their way. Well, interestingly, there's a man named Obadiah that serves as a palace administrator for Ahab, and Obadiah just happens to be a devout believer in God. Interesting, isn't it, that there's somebody that is that devout that is working and leading the palace for such an evil king. And Obadiah is secretly hiding some 100 of God's prophets in 2 separate caves. He has them split up, 50 in one cave and 50 in another cave, and quietly he is providing them with both food and water that they need, which is somewhat remarkable if you're feeding 100 people in the circumstances of the famine that they're enduring right now. That is an extraordinary feat that Obadiah is doing, not just feeding them, but also hiding them and protecting them from the evil king. Well, a day comes in chapter 18 where Ahab and Obadiah are out looking for pasture for their animals to graze upon. And they're running out of grass to feed the animals, and they don't want to have to kill any more animals for lack of food, the Bible says. Never mind King Ahab killing the prophets of God. They don't want to kill any more animals because of the famine. And so here are these two, Ahab and Obadiah, and the Bible says that they literally split up in looking for the greener pastures, and Obadiah just happens to run across the prophet Elijah, and he recognizes him. And there, most definitely, is a bounty on the head of Elijah. Ahab would love to kill this famous prophet. and Obadiah is the one that runs into him. Well, interestingly, as the story goes, Elijah tells Obadiah to go back to your king and tell him that he wants to meet him. And Obadiah is scared with this information, that what happens if I go and tell my king that you want to meet with him, and I set up this meeting and he gets there and then you're not there. He's absolutely going to kill me if that happens. But the meeting is set up, and you can imagine the warm greeting that occurs between the man of God, Elijah the prophet, and the king Ahab, who is killing all of the men of God. But Elijah's challenge and Elijah's message is very simple, very bold, and very straightforward. In the easy-to-read translation, verse 19 says simply, "Meet me at Mount Carmel." Well, I'm going to begin our reading this morning, and I'll pull this slide up on the screen with verse 19, where Elijah is speaking directly to Ahab. "Now tell the people of Israel to meet me at Mount Carmel. And also go ahead and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of the god of Asherah who get their support from Queen Jezebel." Verse 20 says, "So Ahab called all of the Israelites and those prophets to Mount Carmel. And Elijah came to all of the people and he said, 'You must decide what you are going to do now. How long will you keep jumping from one side to the other? If the Lord is the true God, follow him. But if Baal is the true God, then follow him.' And so the people said absolutely nothing. And so Elijah said, 'I am only one prophet. I'm the only prophet of the Lord that is here. But there are 450 prophets of Baal. So bring us 2 bulls and let the prophets of Baal have one of those bulls and let them cut it and kill it, cut it into pieces, and then put the meat on the wood. But don't start your fire. And I will do the exact same with the other bull. And I will not start the fire either. Prophets of Baal, pray to your God, and I will pray to the Lord my God. Whichever God answers the prayer and starts the fire, then that will be the true God that we need to worship." And so interestingly, I would draw this conclusion or this life application lesson from this part of the story that I think is really interesting. That if you tend to drift along with whatever is easy, with whatever is convenient or whatever is mainstream or normal, chances are that one day you will soon discover that you have been worshiping the false god. If you tend to drift along doing whatever is easy, whatever is convenient, whatever is just normally kind of going along or mainstream for the moment, chances are one day you will discover that you have been worshiping a false god. And so here we are in this part of the story. Don't you love great showdowns, especially when a battle is there between good and evil? Don't you love it when there's an underdog in the story that appears to be outnumbered or outmanned or underpowered, but in the end reveals that the real power comes from within, not from our physical appearances? And so here Elijah is, the only prophet of God, and then you've got 450 prophets of Baal and 400 other prophetesses of Asherah that are there, 950 prophets against the one prophet of God. Well, Elijah chose to go against the mainstream. Elijah chose definitely to be the underdog in this scenario. Did you notice that apparently he was the only prophet that was left doing any of the work that God had given them? All of the others were in hiding and Obadiah was protecting them. He's the only one that comes out of hiding on that day. All the others are still hiding in the cave and waiting for Obadiah to come and feed them. And so here Elijah is totally alone, which says something incredible, which says something huge about his faith, his credibility, and his dedication. His circumstance, his surroundings, oh my goodness, here he is, all by himself. On Wednesday nights when we studied this, we talked about the fact that in Elijah's little corner of the world, that idol worship and evil, yes, they were predominant, and immorality was predominant as well, but they were not just tolerated evils that were going on. No, they were legislated evils. It was the law of the land for them to worship that way or for them to act that way. Sounds just a little bit like our world or our country in some circumstances today, doesn't it? So maybe, just perhaps, there are some lessons to learn and draw and take away from Elijah's character in this story. Elijah's willingness to stand against the odds, his readiness to speak out against the evil, even when he's outnumbered. His will to trust God against these incredible odds. Two verses that I would share with you, and I'll bring these up on the screen. One is 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9, where the writer says, "But you're a chosen people. You're a royal priesthood," he says. "You're a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light." And then secondly, John chapter 15 and verse 19 is a verse that you're probably going to be familiar with, but I'll share it from the easy to read translation, where it says, "If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, though, you do not belong to this world, but I have chosen you, I've called you out of the world, and that's why the world hates you." And so interestingly, these two verses certainly kind of fit this story in a very special way. And I would encourage you to hang on to these verses and take them into your heart and understand the difference that God is wanting to make and the difference that God is wanting to be through you, to be the underdog in this world, to be the one that is outnumbered, but certainly to be the one that speaks truth in the middle of the darkness that we live in. Verse 26. is kind of where we pick up in this story, and so I'll bring this up on the screen as well. And so the prophets took the bull that was given to them, this is the prophets of Baal, and they prepared it. And they started praying to the god Baal, and they prayed until noon, the text says. And then they said, "Baal, please answer us." But there was no sound from the god Baal. No one answered. And then they began jumping around on the altar that they had built. I think that's almost a comical picture there. But at noon, Elijah began to make fun of them. Elijah said, "If Baal really is God, maybe you should pray louder. Maybe their God is busy. Maybe he is thinking about something, or maybe he stepped out for a moment. He could be sleeping, you know. Maybe you should pray louder and wake him up." Verse 28 says, "So the prophets did. They prayed louder. They cut themselves with sword and spears." That's the way they worshipped in those days. They cut themselves until they were bleeding all over. The afternoon passed, but the fire had still not started. The prophets, they were out of control, and they continued to act this way until the time came for them for the evening sacrifice. But absolutely nothing happened. There was no answer from Baal. There was no sound from Baal. There was no one listening. I like the way that's worded. And so the application lesson that I would take from this part of the story reads this way. We always have the choice of following the truth or not following the truth, of caving in to what everyone around us is doing. And so I kind of love this picture of the prophets of Baal that are jumping up and down on this grand altar where they have sacrificed this bull. And here they are cutting themselves and screaming louder and louder, and Elijah simply mocking them because of the behavior that they have, because of the God that they're worshiping, and the fact that God is not speaking at all. In this text, I'm sure Elijah had the option of staying maybe back in the cave where all of the other prophets were. But that wasn't his mission. That wasn't what God had called him to. That wasn't his job. That wasn't his duty. His duty was to go against the grain, to challenge the evil that was surrounding him, even to the point of standing face to face and toe to toe with the man that placed the bounty on his head. You see, being faithful isn't about being popular. Being faithful is about doing what God has called us to do, regardless of what may be going on around us or what may be popular. Being on task for what God has called you to do doesn't mean that you can compromise. It doesn't mean that you can negotiate or make concessions based on the current trends or the political leanings of the moment. It doesn't mean that at all. God has actually never asked our opinion about anything, has he? God's never asked us, what do we think about this, or how do we feel about that? No, God's will is God's will, and God's calling is God's calling. And so here you see Elijah standing true and standing strong. Listen to these verses that I pull up on the screen. Romans chapter 12 and verse 2. The easy to read translation of this verse says, don't copy the behaviors. Don't copy the customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good, which is pleasing, which is perfect. Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 15 is another verse that I'll pull up. My son, here getting some advice. My son, don't talk in this way with them. Hold back your foot from their paths. In other words, you don't have to go the direction that everyone else is going. Or Psalms chapter 1 and verse 1 is certainly a verse that fits here. Oh, the joys of those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or stand around with sinners, or join along with the mockers. And so those verses certainly fit this part of the story as well, portraying Elijah as someone that is willing to stand, even if it means standing all by himself. Well, the conclusion of the story begins in verse 30. And so I'll pull this last part of the text up for this morning. Then Elijah, it becomes his turn to light his fire or his altar and begin cooking the bull that he has sacrificed. Then Elijah said to all the people, so now I want you to come here. Come over to my altar, he says. And so they gathered around Elijah, and the Lord's idol had been torn down. So Elijah began repairing it. And Elijah went and he found 12 stones. There was one stone for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. These 12 tribes were named for the 12 sons of Jacob, the man who the Lord had named Israel. And Elijah used these stones to repair the altar to honor the Lord. And he dug a small ditch around the altar. It was wide enough and deep enough to hold about 4 gallons of water. But then Elijah put the wood on the altar, and he cut the bull into pieces, and he laid the pieces on the wood. And then he said, fill those 4 jars with water. And I want you to pour the water on the pieces of the meat that are on the wood. And then Elijah said, do it again. And then he said, do it a 3rd time. And the water ran down off of the altar and filled the ditch. And at about that time for the afternoon sacrifice, the prophet Elijah approached the altar, and he prayed out loud, Lord, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, I'm asking you now to prove that you are the God of Israel and that I am your servant. And so Elijah prayed this prayer. The Lord, show these things to the people, that it was you who commanded me to do all of these things. He said, Lord, answer my prayer. Verse 37. Show these people that you, Lord, are God, and that you are the one who is bringing them back to you. And then the fire came down from the Lord, and it burned the sacrifice, it burned the wood, it even burned the stones and the ground around the altar. And then it dried up. All of the water in the ditch, and all of the people saw this happen, and they bowed down to the ground. And they began saying, the Lord is God. The Lord is God. You see, in this story, I would suggest that there is absolutely no amount of activity that can actually replace the real presence and the real work of God being in your life. Faith is real. Either it's real or it's not. It's either one way or the other. Commitment to God is real. Either you're committed or you're not. And here Elijah provides this incredible example for us. And here, one of the lessons that's easy to miss in this story that I think is absolutely fascinating is the prophet Baal himself. And so I've provided an image of what the prophet or what the god Baal would have looked like, the one that Ahab and Jezebel had legislated that everyone had to worship in the land. He was actually the god of fertility, and he was the god of storms. And so in this graphic or this picture, one of the things that you'll notice is that he is predicted as a strident warrior bearing a bolt of lightning in his hand. And if you look at the top of that picture, there he is holding this bolt of lightning in his hand. And think about the importance that that image would have on the children of Israel. That the god Baal is the god of storms. And here the god of storms, the land of Israel, is literally dying in the midst of a famine. We can't get it to rain. And the god Baal, the god of storms, can't make it rain either. And here is Elijah that has challenged us to this showdown at Mount Carmel. And we are supposed to be the place where our sacrifice that is on our altar is asking our God to light the fire. And Baal literally has a lightning bolt in his hand, and he can't light the fire. Surely that meant something incredible to the children of Israel when they saw the God of Elijah light the fire, and not just light a fire. It was a big fire. It burned all of the wood. It burned all of the sacrifice that was on top of the wood. It even burned the stones, the Bible said, and the ground that was underneath it. And if the God that you're worshiping isn't real, it doesn't matter what you're doing, that God can't see it. If that God isn't real, that God can't see anything. And I believe that's where the children of Israel here are provided with this spectacular demonstration. It doesn't matter what you say or what you pray. If your God isn't real, your God isn't listening, because your God can't listen. And that's exactly what Elijah wanted his fellow Israelites to understand. That the God they had been worshiping, the ones that they had been listening to, the prophets that they had been learning from, that none of that was real. There's no amount of activity that can replace the actual presence, the actual work of God in your life. Your faith is either real or it isn't. Your commitment to God is either real or it isn't. Two verses that I would close with this morning. The God that we worship, the God that we celebrate, the God that we walk with is real. That's the God that we worship this morning. He is with us every single moment of every single day. And so I want to close with these two verses, John chapter 14 and verse 16, and then secondly a verse from 1 John chapter 1 and verse 6. John chapter 14 and verse 16. And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to help you, to be with you forever. So what is Jesus saying here? Not only am I with you, but I'm asking God the Father to send his Spirit to not only be with you, but to live inside of you as well. To be a part of your life and to be with you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of your life. What a comforting challenge that is. But then secondly, 1 John chapter 1 and verse 6, if we claim that we have fellowship with him, and yet we continue to walk in darkness, then we lie, and we don't live out the truth that we say we're living out. If we claim to have fellowship with him, and yet we continue to walk in darkness, what the writer is saying is if we're doing that, then we're literally living a lie. The profession of faith that we claim, it's not real. The commitment of faith that we're claiming, that it's not real. Either it's real or it's not. Either we're committed or we're not. And so this morning, as we look at this story, as we look at this showdown, is what I would call it at Mount Carmel, we're given an incredible example of one man's faith, willing to stand against the odds, willing to go against what everyone around him was doing. The odds here are 950 prophets to 1. And Elijah stands strong, and Elijah stands true, and Elijah stands committed. And I don't know about you, but this text in this story in 1 Kings chapter 18 challenges me about how I'm living my life in this world. Sure, there may be things that are going on around me, and it would be tempting or it would be easy to simply go along with the flow and do what everyone else is doing. But that's not what God has called his children to do, is it? And so this morning, as we look at this story, as we look at some of these principles that we've brought up on the screen, I would encourage you and challenge you to think about the calling that God has made on our life, that he's asking you to live your life differently, that he's challenging you to be holy, not because you're holy, but because he is, and that his promises will always come true, and that his presence will always be available to us. And so this morning, as we kind of close this lesson out, I would encourage you maybe to think about going back and reading part of the story, and maybe go back to some of the notes that you've pulled up or some of the other verses that we've added, and look again at those and be encouraged by those this morning. Hopefully next Sunday is going to be a better weather week, and we're able to gather back together. Our services at Inner City are always on Sunday morning. We have an early service at 9:30. We have a late service at 11 o'clock. Children's classes are available during the 11 o'clock hour, and so we always make those available. Wednesday night, normally we're here meeting for adult class, teenage class. That's at 7 o'clock on Wednesday night. Normally during the week, we have children's classes on Monday night and Tuesday night at our site, and then also at some of our other learning centers. And so most of those have probably been closed down this week, so hopefully next week's going to be a much better week. Regardless, we look forward to seeing you at worship either at 9:30 or at 11. Thank you for joining us on YouTube or on Facebook or whatever venue you're on. Thank you for being here with us this morning. Hopefully we'll see you next Sunday. God bless.